Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
Fine. We may have had a tough childhood, but that was years ago, and now we're adults. We can just put it behind us and go on, right? Maybe not so much. Whether we realize it or not, unprocessed childhood trauma can compromise the rest of our lives. How do we heal it? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you on the X Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net, divisions of Relmar McConnell Media Company, with studios and corporate offices in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. With us this hour to discover hidden atrocities, the lingering trauma of childhood abuse, is Kaytee GILLIS. Kaytee is a psychotherapist and author with a passion for working with survivors of relationship and family trauma. Her work focuses on assisting survivors of domestic violence and family trauma. She's published 3 books, all on the topic of traumatic relationships or families. Her latest book is Breaking the Cycle: The 6 Stages of Healing from Childhood Family Trauma. Her website, KayteeLynn-GILLIS-LCSW.com. Kaytee, thanks so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. This is a very important topic.
Absolutely, it is, and no more than now. I think everybody's so much under stress, and where before, people might be able to, check their behavior. Now it's like people are popping off all over the place. So it's such a good topic.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So what made you decide to focus your practice on relationship trauma?
So I am a survivor of family trauma. I am pretty open about that. I am both a survivor of traumatic relationships and family trauma. I think that there is a huge link for some reason. But so when I was going through the beginning of my healing journey, probably about college age-ish, I was really struggling to find a therapist who got it, who understood, the dynamics and the symptoms and the presenting factors and all of that. And so from my struggles and my difficulties trying to find a therapist, I kept saying, one thing the whole time. I kept saying, I want to be a therapist so that way people, who need someone to go to, I want to be that person that they can come to, someone who gets it.
Totally understandable.
Yeah.
You said something interesting, and it's something that I have a curiosity about, is if we have suffered childhood abuse and childhood trauma, do we tend to then re-engage with that in the relationships we choose later in later life?
So I always like to give the disclaimer that not every pattern is the same, of course. There are many people who've had abusive or traumatic relationships, interpersonal relationships and romantic relationships who maybe have not had family trauma. And there are people who have had really traumatic childhoods and child trauma within their family, and then they go on to have healthy relationships. So it is definitely not, across the board. However, there is a common link because when we grow up in traumatic environments, we learn to excuse bad behavior. We learn to intellectualize it. We learn to make excuses, and we
kind of
learn
normalize it,
yeah,
right?
yeah, we learn to normalize it. And so then when we go on and we kind of experience it again in romantic relationships or even friendships, it is less likely that people who survived like that are able to have the coping skills and the self-awareness to recognize it as being dangerous.
Can also, one thing that I've observed is sometimes it seems like, a person that's had an abusive history will almost like draw the abuse out of a person. So the other person can be in another relationship and not necessarily be abusive, but when they get together, then there's that perfect storm with someone that has learned to just accept abuse as their due, then it bubbles to the surface. Is this a thing?
I see that a lot in what I would call, because there's different levels of traumatic relationships. There's different levels of toxic relationships. That's the big word my clients use now is toxic. That the younger crowd uses that word. So there's a big difference between traumatic, toxic, abusive. there are, like in the example of what you're talking about, I would call that, if both people had, really traumatic experiences growing up and a lot of emotional reactivity, a lot of really poor coping skills and lack of self-awareness, like you said, it almost creates this perfect storm of, this mutual toxicity and stuff like that. Absolutely.
So let's back up a little bit. And would you mind defining relationship trauma for us?
So I know that that is a really broad word. It is, relationship itself is a broad word, and then trauma is a broad word. So I like to kind of describe it almost like an umbrella. So you have an umbrella, and the umbrella is the trauma, or the umbrella is your relationships, and is anything that kind of falls underneath that umbrella. So anything that you would define as being something that sticks with you, something that impacted you, and something that you have been either unable to shake off or unable to work through, whatever it is that happened. And I always want to tell people that trauma is not just about what happened to you, but it's about, did you have any tools to get through it? Did you have the support you needed to get through it? What did you do to get through it? So there's what happened, whether it's a singular what or whether it's many whats. There's what happened, and then there's how did you get through it? Did you get through it? What did that look like for you? And what did you take with you? What did you take with you? What meanings? How did you internalize it? Things like that.
And then the other one is what are patterns of domestic violence?
So, patterns of domestic violence, that is another thing that's so broad. So things like abuse, you have emotional abuse, we have physical abuse, of course there's sexual abuse, financial abuse, things like that. It is very broad. So if there is a pattern of abuse, pattern of violence that is, um, you know ongoing, and things like that, that's what I would call a pattern of domestic violence.
Okay. Can a person be a victim of domestic violence and not recognize it, not even know that
Oh
that
yeah.
was the case?
Oh yeah, that's actually very common in my experience for people who've had, I think, the more traumatic of a background that they've had. Maybe if they've had a really traumatic childhood, maybe there was a lot of domestic violence in their home. A lot of times clients will say to me, "Oh, I didn't even realize that that was abusive," or "I didn't even realize that that was, traumatic," or "I didn't even realize that that was something that wasn't okay. I didn't realize that." And so they go on to either, repeat those patterns in their own relationships, or just to kind of normalize it in their conversation and in their life, and without even realizing sometimes that, yeah, that was abusive, and that was, really something that impacted you.
Well, if you don't recognize it, then you can't heal it or process it very well, can you?
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, recognizing really is the first step, because I find that most people don't really realize, that their background was traumatic until they're able to, um, place it against something else or compare it against something else. So you'll see a lot of young people, like a lot of young kids, and they don't even realize that they're living in such chaos or such dysfunction until they grow up, and maybe they have a partner who has a healthier family, or maybe they have coworkers or colleagues who have, healthier families, and they're able to kind of make those connections and say, that's not what I went through, or that's not normal, and they're able to really make those comparisons.
So, what are the signs a person may have been or isn't currently a victim of domestic abuse or family abuse?
So I would say, so if someone was a victim of a relational trauma, like domestic violence within their family, I would be looking for things like a heightened emotional reaction, difficulties with relationships, maybe patterns that they're repeating with relationships and things like that. That's usually what I would look for someone who has had a relational trauma background, a family relation trauma background, without maybe having much more information than that.
So, when you talk about emotional reactivity, are you talking about like triggering, like their emotions are well beyond what the current circumstance
Mm.
would warrant?
Thank you for asking that, because I definitely, I speak, that mental health speak. And so definitely, if I use words like that, sometimes, people will say to me like, hold on, that's
Stop
mental
at the
health speak.
bus.
Hold on a second. So yes, relational, emotional reactivity is the emotion or is the reaction to the event. Does it match the event? And a lot of times people who've had relational trauma, and what I mean by that is family trauma, people who grew up with trauma in their family of origin, with dysfunction in their family of origin, whether it's psychological abuse, violence, there's lack of communication or lack of healthy communication, I should say. Those kind of patterns will then manifest into adulthood where people are struggling to uh, react to things appropriately, whether it's boundaries, whether it's being met with an unfair situation or being treated badly, and their reactions do not fit the event that happened. They will overreact, and that can look like many different things.
So, like one of the situations would be, someone is in something minor happens and they go off the ease, right?
Mhm.
And you go, what are you going to do when something real happens? So it's not necessarily that they're just weak
Yeah.
and can't take any kind of disruption, but rather there might be something unprocessed in there. Is that what we're
Mhm.
looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. When you see those reactions, and I always have to say, of course, there could be other things. We could be looking at someone who has an intellectual disability. We could be looking at something neurological. I kind of have to give that disclaimer, of course. But for the most part, absent those other diagnoses, if someone has a reaction that just doesn't fit the moment, then yes, usually that's what's happening is they've been triggered, whether it's an emotional trigger. Sometimes when I'm talking about triggers, I like to refer to them almost as like sensitivities. Trigger right now kind of has a buzzword, I think, in our society. And so but it is a trigger, and it's emotional sensitivity. So when you see someone, they didn't get the flavor of ice cream that they want, and they flip chairs, think of how a child would act. Think of that's a normal reaction for a toddler or a child. They ran out of chocolate ice cream, I'm going to throw myself on the floor. That's a normal reaction for a child. So someone who's had childhood trauma, someone who has had trauma during that age, can sometimes have reactions like that in a
Match
30
the age. We have a
30
clue,
year
right?
old, you
Yeah.
you can't,
Well, it's
yeah.
time for us to take a station break. Katie and I will return very shortly, so don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Heal or repeat? Is family trauma passed on? With us this hour, discussing the far reaching effects of childhood trauma, is Kaytee Gillis, the author of Breaking the Cycle: The 6 Stages of Healing from Childhood Family Trauma. So that does pose a question, Kaytee. Is trauma passed on through the generations, if you will?
Mhm. Absolutely. It it continues to pass on until someone stops and says, "Hey, this isn't okay. This is a pattern that is not working for whatever reason." However, it's passed on in different ways. So what someone, like what our grandmothers maybe went through, they maybe weren't allowed to react in traumatic ways, or the same reactions that maybe our mothers or we have, or our daughters would be able to react. And what I mean by that is because with each generation, especially depending on someone's faith and someone's ethnicity, someone's gender, there's different reactions that are acceptable, different social rules and things like that. So it will look different, but yes, it is passed down.
So we're talking about passing it down as in the way we parent.
Yes, it is the way we parent. It is everything from the way that we interact with other people. So, let's say, I always use arbitrary examples, things that people don't think about. Someone knocking on the door. How do you react to the delivery driver if they have the wrong order? And some of that stuff people will say, "Oh, that's really minor. That isn't even anything that I would think about." But it is your reaction to being, if you feel like you were slighted, if you feel abandoned, if you feel rejected, if you feel disrespected in any way, your children or the young people who are around you, your nieces and nephews and your cousins, things like that, they will see this interaction. They are seeing your reaction. So it comes out in your parenting, it comes out in your friendships, your ability to interact with colleagues and with superiors at work and really everywhere in your life.
So the children are witnessing this and seeing
hmm
it as they model themselves after it?
So the children see it, and children learn what they see. And they learn what they see, but it doesn't mean that they repeat it 100%. I feel like there's two things that tend to happen. Children will, when in times of stress, we revert back to what we know. And so in a stressful environment, if a child saw mom picking up, a bottle to drink every single time she was stressed out, or if the child saw mom avoiding food when she was stressed out, anything like that, um, then when the child is stressed out, they may have those same reactions to things, but they don't always have to be the exact same. Like, and what I mean by that is like a child who saw mom have a poor relationship with food, maybe that child will also learn poor relationships with food, but it doesn't mean the same. If the parent overate, doesn't mean the child's going to overeat. It's not exactly the same, but children learn that this is how we cope with stress. We put something in our body, or we avoid something for our body, or things like that. Children learn, okay, stress means do this reaction
Right.
to cope with it.
How about the reverse of that, where a child watches their parent do something when as they're growing up and think, "I'm not gonna be like that."
hmm
So they actually overcompensate in the other direction. What
hmm
does that look like?
Yep, and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because that's what I meant by the other. And I feel like the pendulum kind of swings both ways. So, an example of that is a child who grows up in an alcoholic environment who then says, "I'm never going to have a drink ever because I watched my dad or my mom, whoever, react to any stressful environment or just use alcohol as a coping skill all the time. And so I'm going to avoid alcohol." And that in and of itself, people might say, well, why is that a bad thing? Because you're still having that unhealthy reaction or that unhealthy relationship with whatever it is, whether it's food, alcohol, whatever. Avoiding alcohol for health reasons, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if it's, you're still basing that fear and that reaction off of the experience and the power that that substance held over your family.
Does that tend to then make people, judgmental against the anybody that does drink versus just, "Oh, this isn't for me"? Is that one of the clues that somebody is reacting to it rather than making a choice?
I think it depends on where people are in their healing. In the very beginning, you might have people who are, um, they associate, okay, drinker for me, people who were drinking was scary because when I was a child, people were drinking and then they acted in scary ways. So you might have people do that same, innocent association that a child would have. Drinking is bad. So people who are drinking are going to scare me, or they're going to put me in an unsafe situation. It depends on where people are in their healing. And then there are people who are able to just say, it's not for me, and it really depends on what happened around the substance. How did the child internalize it, or how did the young person internalize it? And how are they using that in their own adulthood?
Does it also have to do with how healed they are from the original trauma?
It can, because as we know in the mental health community, substances, and when I say substance, I mean anything. We can talk legal stuff, illegal stuff. Food is the biggest substance that I, tend to think of or see, and that's readily available and very legal. Um, Children will then say, okay, I saw this being handled in an unhealthy way. This is what I'm going to. This is how I'm going to react and internalize that.
Okay.
Mhm.
So there's another thing that I've been hearing a lot about lately, talking about epigenetics and actually genetically passing down
Mm.
trauma. Are you
Mm.
familiar with that, and what's your take on it?
I'm familiar with it. I don't know if I know too much about, I don't have my own studies or anything like that about genetics. I do know that we as humans will pass on, like, let's say that a person is pregnant with a child, and that person is going through stress, that child inside the person is feeling that stress. So I have seen in my practice, and that I have some awareness of. As far as genetics, like through generations, I don't know if I necessarily have a lot of experience with that.
Not necessarily in your skill set, right? We'll
I
talk
mean,
to.
I know it's a thing. I know that there's been books. I think it was Mark, someone who wrote the book. It didn't start with you. That's another one.
So, what are some major factors that influence survivors' ability to recognize that their past was unhealthy?
Um. So what influences a child's ability to
Or an
to uh
adult to
okay.
recognize that their past was unhealthy? Because like we were talking about
Hmm.
normalizing it. What what influences a person to start to
Hmm.
recognize it?
So the biggest things that people tend to see are things like relational patterns. So if you're in a relationship and you tend to repeat the same pattern again and again and again, a lot of times this can happen because you are either in a state of denial. Maybe you have intellectualized the relationship or intellectualized the situation and what it is that's going on. And there's a lot of, things, other factors too that come in, whether someone's culture, whether someone's gender, and things like that. So that's the biggest thing I notice, that people tend to look at patterns.
One thing that again I've witnessed is someone, they'll relay some horrific thing like being beaten
Hmm.
severely with a belt, and then just follow it with, "Yeah, but I was being a little shite. I deserved that."
Yeah, that's a perfect example. It's a perfect example of someone who is excusing what happened to them. You'll
Okay.
see people say, "Oh, well, dad was stressed out or mom was drinking and we didn't know any better."
So would that also then make them more vulnerable to passing it on to their children if they haven't recognized the
Mhm.
fact that it's not okay?
Oh, absolutely. And that
Mhm.
is part of why, is probably the biggest reason why it has been passed on for so long, because only recently are we really starting to even have these conversations about childhood trauma. It was stigmatized a lot.
Well, parenting has changed a lot over the years. It
Mhm.
started with, spare the rod, spoil the child. And then it
Yes.
went into the, oh, don't you dare disrupt anything. And we end up bringing up a bunch of crazy,
Mhm.
irresponsible, ungrounded brats, right?
Yeah.
So, so where's the balance here?
I know, and that's why I always say, parenting is the most impossible, hardest, difficult job, because it is one of those things where it's like, what is the right thing to do? And I always want to say that to parents.
So I guess part of the question that I didn't really ask very well is, does our perception of abuse shift with the accepted culture's parenting
Mhm.
practices?
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. You mentioned culture. I have clients who are from another country than maybe client B. Client A, client B, and what they consider punishment is different than person B. And it's not necessarily up for me to decide what is, considered punishment versus not, or what is considered acceptable punishment versus not. So sometimes it's easier, for lack of a better word, to almost talk about, what's considered abuse, and then kind of come back from there to what is considered culturally appropriate. But yes, it does shift everything from, the way parenting was done in the 20s, how much we allowed men to be a part of their children's life, to now, and the expectations based on gender, based on family, and all of those things.
So it also seems like, if you're living in a culture where everybody accepts a particular punishment,
Hmm.
is it less traumatic to be punished in that way?
it that's a hard one. Because trauma is so much of what we take away from it, and not necessarily, I mean, an example could be someone who's living in a war environment, and everyone else is also in that same environment. It's hard to know what people are going to take away from it, and how it will internalize them, and how they will use that, or how they will internalize that as they move forward. But I would say that if there's a cultural expectation that something is considered okay, maybe it will take them a lot longer to come out of that stage of denial.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood. Yeah. 'Cause, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. So what was
Mhm.
punishment for a simple crime there was
Yes.
way different than what we do here. And that's what had me wondering is if it's normal for the society, is it less traumatic for the individual?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I would say that something like an extreme punishment for something that the child sees is going to be traumatic either way. However, how are we, we as a society, we as a world, able to differentiate between the trauma that they saw from witnessing that situation,
Right.
and what are they allowed to speak of it? Are
Mm.
they, their gender, their power in society?
Well, it's that time again. We're going to have another station break. Katie and I will be right back. So you stay there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. I don't remember that. With us discussing childhood trauma is Kaylee Gills. Kaylee, very often it's my understanding that people actually don't have any memory. They have big blocks that they don't remember in their childhood.
Mhm.
Is that related to abuse?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I always tell clients, don't try to piece together memories that you don't remember, because that can actually be very dangerous, because you can actually create memories. But so sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes there's a neurological element, sometimes it's just how someone's memory developed.
So, what do you mean by create memories? I mean, I've heard of it legally,
Okay.
created memory. That was a big deal 20 years ago.
So I'm wondering if it's the same thing of what you're referencing. So what happened is research has shown that if we, like, let's say a child says, "Oh, I don't," a person says, "I don't remember between ages 3 to 8." That's a big chunk of time. That's a big difference between, if you don't remember between 3 and 4, that's probably normal. If you don't remember at anything until age 8 or age 10, as a clinician, I I might kind of say, okay, maybe there's some trauma, but I kind of file it just to kind of, see what else might be going on. But what happens is we can actually kind of create something that if we feel like maybe we were physically abused or sexually abused, maybe we can create that or kind of convince ourselves that that is something that happened. And I'm not saying it hasn't. I mean, I would say as a clinician, if there's years of absent memory, I would assess for trauma.
Do you kind of triangulate information as in, okay, they don't remember from ages 3 to age 9,
Mhm.
and they're demonstrating symptoms of
Mhm.
childhood abuse.
Mhm.
So then do you look closer at that time period?
Mhm. Yeah, it is definitely all done with a thorough assessment. Is a thorough conversation. What there's the absence of memories, but yet there's no symptoms of trauma, meaning no relational symptoms, no other things that would point to a trauma reaction. Maybe and maybe the person has, let's say, they're neurodivergent and they have a diagnosis of autism, or maybe there's a neurological element. Then that could explain it. But yes, I look for the whole picture. What things are they presenting? What brought them to therapy? What happened? What's the first thing you remember after age 8 or 9? And why is that significant?
What are the most debilitating symptoms of having childhood or family abuse?
I would say that the struggles with self-esteem, the struggles with interpersonal relationships, it can really impact everything from friendships and an ability to, have a roommate, things like that, that maybe other people take for granted. Things like being able to have a healthy relationship with your coworkers, being able to advocate for yourself with your boss. It really is those interpersonal connections, the ability to talk to another person in a healthy way and advocate for yourself, and also receive that same feedback from other people without having unhealthy reactions or extreme reactions.
We were talking about triggers, and sometimes people, they've dated for years, everything's been beautiful, they get married and, oh, la, 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 oy vey.
Yes.
So would that possibly be an example of triggers because all of a sudden now we're mom and pop and or man and wife instead of,
Mhm.
relationship. So if there was relationship trauma as a child in regards to a married couple, would that be what they were looking at possibly?
Usually if it's bringing out some childhood trauma and there was absolutely nothing before, let's say they've been married for 10 years and then all of a sudden there's a trigger, that I don't know if I guess it could happen. I don't know if I see that a lot. Usually what I see is, stuff builds. So you'll see the triggers even during the dating stage, things like that. Um, Life changes will bring on different triggers. So if someone is a parent for the first time, then that will bring on, maybe if they were abused as a child, physically or sexually, then now they have a child, they're going to have triggers, sensitivities to their child being alone with an adult who they don't know. I mean, I think most parents would probably have a problem with that, but there's a difference between being observant and having an extreme emotional reaction to something. So yeah.
How about being triggered into wanting to pass on abuse, like the child drops a glass of milk when they were a kid, they dropped a
Mm.
glass of milk, they got knocked off their chair. So they all of a sudden have the urge.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay, is that a sign? And then if that is
Mhm.
a sign and that shows up for you, what do you do?
So that I'm so glad you brought that up because that is so common because like I said before, we revert to what we know in times of stress. So in the moment where, the glass hits the floor and you hear the glass shattering and you see the milk, we're not in our relational and healthy reaction brain. We are now in our fight or flight brain. We are now in our we have to quickly, interact and interject and solve this problem. So
Now,
that
are
is
we
what you
in
see.
are we in the fight or flight because we associate the breaking glass with the abuse that we had?
It is sometimes because of that, but it is that extreme reaction to the glass breaking is the feeling of I need to solve this problem really fast. I need to get out of this and often it can be a result of maybe if they broke a glass they were hit or
Right.
something like
Hmm.
that. So a lot of times it can be that same, triggering reaction. So it does get people to again revert back to that to what they know and to react to the glass.
So what's your advice to a parent? I mean, we all had,
Yeah.
mom lost it on us at one
Oh
point or
yeah.
another, or dad
Yes.
or
Yes.
sibling.
Hmm.
So I think that this is something, it's a matter of degree, isn't it? We have
Hmm. Yes.
things that are going to trigger us. We all have
Yes.
our triggers.
Yes.
So if a parent that's been a loving parent and getting along fine, everything's been going, all of a sudden has a hair trigger urge to strike their child for something small.
Hmm.
What do you say? What do you do there?
So the first thing I want to say is, whether you're hearing this, because and whether you've already done the act or whether you've caught yourself, first, take a breath and realize, okay, I'm human and I'm doing the first thing I need to do, which is to develop self-awareness into what happened. And if you're able in that moment, take a step back, even if you need to turn your body away, because you have less than a second in that moment to really figure out what you're going to do. You don't have 10 minutes to sit down and think about a healthier way. So turn your body, turn your face away, do something to kind of break that energy shift and focus on something else. And a lot of times it will help you, that will provoke a breath if you turn and bring some of the heightened emotional reactivity down.
So people that have been severely abused throughout their childhood are just a ball of triggers if it hasn't been processed. So they're
Often.
almost as much a victim of this thing as the child that
Oh
they're
yes.
bringing up.
Mhm.
Yes?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I work with parents just as often as children because I've said it a thousand times. It's the hardest job anyone would ever have to do, and they're children inside their adult brain reacting to their own abuse that hasn't been dealt with.
You mentioned earlier how a person will respond like a 2-year-old if their damage happened at that time. Is that for you as a therapist or for us as individuals? Is that a good way to start tracking back to find what the damage was and heal it?
It's hard because rarely is it one point in their life, unless there was in the mental health field, we call trauma big T and little t. And what I mean by that is big T could be like, let's say one big thing happened to you, maybe an assault, maybe a car accident, um, a natural disaster that uprooted you from your home. Maybe that's a one big T trauma. However, a lot of times with relational trauma, with family trauma, you're not seeing one big thing where you can point, okay, this was January 10th, 1996. It is every January, every February, all through 1990. You can't really look back and say, okay, this was age 5 because it's so many years.
How about holidays?
Mhm.
It seems like we have a lot of baggage around holidays. What's going on there?
Holidays because there's the nostalgia, and nostalgia is not always a good thing. There is the reaction of what we've experienced during previous holidays. We anticipate that same feeling that we've had before. So if we've had, you know, multiple Thanksgivings that were traumatic as a childhood, and if we've had Passovers that were extremely dysfunctional, Christmases that were extremely dysfunctional, we are then going to have that same heightened anxiety around those upcoming holidays.
So people that just cringe when Christmas music
Yes.
comes on, there might be something else going on.
Sometimes, yes. I would say I hate to say a blanket statement, yes, because some people maybe they just don't like Christmas, especially if their birthday falls on Christmas and they have to compete with it. But um, yeah, joking aside, I would say, yeah, if there's a difference between, oh, I really just don't like this holiday versus I have this extreme emotional physical reaction. I'm having, high blood pressure, I'm having anxiety, loss of sleep. What's going on here about this particular holiday?
So again, you're measuring degree of response
hmm
to decide how severe the original problem was.
It is not necessarily how severe the original problem was, but how well you've coped with it and how much you're been able to go through it. I know personally I can kind of get through a holiday now a lot easier than 10 to 15 years ago, but it is how well you've internalized it, how well you've been able to cope with it. Because a lot of times people will say, oh, I should be having a great time. It's the holidays, it's Christmas. You listen to the music and you watch the shows and everyone just seems happy. So there's all these shoulds. I should be happy. I should be grateful. I should see my family. And then there's this rush after, the day after Christmas where everyone's like, "Oh, I shouldn't have gone home. I shouldn't have done this. I knew it." There's a lot of guilt tripping that happens around the holidays that we do to ourselves.
Yeah, they can certainly be complex, can't they?
Yeah.
So it's about that time for us to take another station break. Please stay with us as Katie and I continue to explore the lasting impact of childhood trauma. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. If we've been abused as children, how do we heal it as adults? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Kaytee Gillis. Her website, Kaytee Lynn Gillis, lcsw.com. So there's the question for this segment. How do we heal this?
It is. So the first thing is just being open to acknowledging. There's so much resistance and there's so much stigma involved with talking about our past because people think that that means we have to assign blame or we have to, there's a lot of finger pointing. Like if I had this trauma, then it must be someone's fault. So, and everyone has a different journey with that part of healing. But I like to say, start with just acknowledging, start with saying, hey, this is something that happened to me and I want to get better about it. Maybe looking back over relationships that you've had, interpersonal relationships or romantic relationships Are there any patterns that you feel that could have been better for you? Or did you contribute to them in any way? Or maybe do you have a pattern of ignoring red flags? And just kind of seeing where it goes from there. It's really small steps from there.
So, pattern of ignoring red flags, could it
Mhm.
also be a pattern of not seeing them in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, ignoring could be not seeing them. Ignoring could be, "Oh, I didn't even realize that was a red flag," or ignoring could be, "Well, that's how my dad always treated my mom, or my mom always treated us, and so I didn't know that was abnormal." Or it could be a third thing, "I knew it was abnormal, but I don't know if I necessarily deserve any better, or I don't know if I know how to have a healthy relationship." There's so much fear involved in people who've had relational trauma, people who have gone through dysfunctional and chaotic and abusive families. There's so much fear in having a healthy relationship. There's a fear of maybe people won't like me if they know the real me, because if this is a healthy person and I'm not, and this is our subconscious brain. We don't have these actual conversations with ourselves, but there's a lot of fear of, will I be able to have a healthy relationship? What will that look like for me? It's scary.
And we tend to, water seeks its own level. Do we,
Hmm.
if we're unprocessed, do we tend to actually seek out people that are at the same level of damage as we are?
We tend to. It's like the law of trauma. The law of relational trauma is that we're going to find people who have the same, or similar relational trauma, because we're both really trying to figure out and work through anything that is unresolved from childhood. And so you will see that a lot with couples. Like, people who do couples work will see that, the same kind of push and pull. Yeah.
So, what about trying to get into a relationship? And this is all unconscious, okay?
Mhm.
But do people get into a relationship with the hopes they get somebody just like daddy, with the hopes of getting it right this time and maybe daddy will love me?
Yes, that is so, so common. Because think of like our inner child. So our inner, like little Katie is wanting to find someone who will not abandon her, the way dad did, for example. Or little Johnny is thinking of, maybe he's trying to find a woman who is going to not make him feel bad, like mom did. Or so we get into these relationships with the hope of working through whatever trauma happened to us, whatever maladaptive coping skills that we learned from having a parent or a caregiver with a traumatic history. We try to work through that in our interpersonal relationships, and it ends up being the emotional our our romantic relationships will bring out any trauma that we have had, like that, more than anything.
No wonder love is is
Yes.
is one big modern mess.
It
Yeah.
is it will come out in a romantic relationship before anything else. I mean, it comes on other things too, but it is definitely a romantic relationship that will show it.
Why is that?
Because there's a level of intimacy that is the closest you're gonna get to a child caregiver relationship. Now, of course, it's different intimacy, but I mean, it's that same emotional closeness, that same emotional bonding that you're not going to get with, a coworker or something like that. Where there's that level of removal, there's a level of professionalism. But people who are even a best friend, sometimes, your best friends will bring out some of your inner wounds too, as well. But with a best friend, there's enough of a removal that you can maybe take some emotional distance. With a relationship, with a romantic relationship, there is not the same amount of emotional distance. They're bringing out any and all emotional wounds that you've had, that you have not worked through. It just has to come out with the partner.
Well, for the most part, the last time we really lived with someone
Mhm.
was when we were in our family of origin, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And it
Roommates
just
have, they can have basic, I'm sure stuff comes up there,
oh,
but
yeah.
but
Mhm.
if we're really committed to somebody, then we're stuck
Yeah.
like we were stuck with our family.
And we're trying
Okay.
to create, we'll have those same power struggles. Like, no, I'm not going to give in, because all the times that I was a child, I had to give in, and I was made to feel like I was, less than or whatever. And so, but couples aren't saying that. They're not saying, "Oh, I don't want to give in because it reminds me of being a child and being powerless," because very few of us, especially in the moment, you're not going to have that level of awareness in the moment. In the moment, you're just like, no, I need you to pick up your socks because I'm sick of picking up your socks. Like, you're not thinking of the connection.
Right, right.
Mhm.
And this is the third time I've asked, and now I'm really getting mad rather
Yes.
than I'm extremely mad and it's over the top for what the situation is,
And
right?
that's why you'll
Yeah.
see couples that have things like, I use the sock example. My partner, he laughs. He'll listen to this and laugh. He knows he leaves the socks everywhere. That actually doesn't bother me at all. Like, I could pick up socks all day, it doesn't bother me. Um, but then something will bother me that maybe doesn't bother, other people. So it is so interesting how different we all are with our own, sensitivities.
Well, there's another thing that we see a lot of in our society at this point, and that's where there's been a divorce and there's
Mhm.
shared parenting, okay,
Mhm.
and maybe the one family is a little more bringing out the rod than the
Yes.
other, and the
Yeah.
child is, suffering abuse, but it's not the kind of abuse, or maybe even if it is, that can be turned in, that sort of thing. If
Mhm.
you're a parent and you feel that your child is suffering family abuse when you can't be with them,
Yeah.
is there a way that you can help that child while they're growing up versus them having to face it all when they're adult?
Yes. Be the healthy parent. And what I mean by that is, you know, focus on being the healthy parent. Focus on being the one who, even if they don't see it now, focus on being the one who they can go to, who maybe isn't gaslighting them, who isn't challenging their reality, who isn't making them feel bad for who they are, what they are, things like that. Focus on being just the healthy sounding board. And sometimes it takes a while for kids to realize, what a healthy, because you don't know what a healthy adult is when you're a kid. You just think back to who was a healthy adult for you. And in the moment, you may not have said, oh, this is a healthy adult. You just knew, okay, I feel safe with this person. I feel like I can talk to them.
What advice do you have for parents? Say their child, 9 years old. That's a nice
Hmm.
middle age,
Yeah.
and they're complaining about the way they're being treated, and
Hmm.
from what they're saying, it's not okay. How can we verbalize that in such a way as to not further traumatize them or to give them tools versus um, coming into a fisticuff disagreement
Hmm.
with our ex?
Hmm. So I think it is important to tell children in age appropriate ways what is okay and what is not. The issue we have right now in our family court system, is that this is such a hot button topic because there are so many dueling accusations, with post separation abuse type situations in courts where one person is saying, hey, they're abusing my child, he's abusing my child and I can't get the child away. And then when the person goes in to try to remove, or to try to say, hey, I need this to change, then they're accused of, parental alienation. So it is really hard, and it's really case by case, because if the parent, like in this case, let's say the mother is saying to the child, you're being abused and this is what's happening, I have seen that then turn around, and the opposing counsel tries to, use that as evidence of parental alienation. So it is
It's a
very
mess.
it is a mess right now,
Yeah,
and
it
it
sure is.
is extremely. I really want to validate how sad and traumatic and stressful it is, and how I wish I had the answer of, like, this is what to do, because it really is so case by case depending on
Yeah,
what's going on.
I understand. Well, it's a time in the show when I have to ask you, Katie, what's your mission?
My mission is to just spread awareness about family trauma and relational trauma, and just how it affects us, without necessarily assigning blame, but just bringing awareness for everyone who needs it.
That's a very worthy and much needed mission at this time.
Yeah.
If we are struggling with
Hmm.
processing what's happened to us,
Mhm.
What tools do you have to offer? What tools do you have for people?
So I like people to take time and digest things slowly. For example, this segment, you just heard a lot of stuff. We talked about a lot of very serious issues. Take time for yourself. Don't immediately run up and go do the meetings that you have to do, or I mean, maybe you have to do the meetings, but like allow yourself to really acknowledge, hey, that's something that happened. For some people that looks like journaling. For some people that's the last thing they want to do is write it down, but maybe they just spend some time kind of thinking and just validating, hey, this was hard to hear this stuff, and just validating what that can be like, and acknowledge the sensitivity that you might need to pay to yourself as you get through maybe the next few hours or few days, or whenever another thing that comes up that triggers that sensitivity within you.
Well, it's been wonderful having you on. Unfortunately, we are out of time in the show.
Thank
Kaytee, thank
you.
you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. Our guest this hour has been Kaytee Gillis, psychotherapist and author of 3 books. Her latest, Breaking the Cycle: The 6 Stages of Healing from Childhood Family Trauma. To find out more about Kaytee and where you can find her books, visit her website, Kaytee Gills lcsw.com. .com. That's Katie Lynn Gills, lcsw.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join us right here next time. This mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to an evolving world.